In November 2019, on a bitterly cold morning, employees of a construction company in an historic farm that had been abandoned for decades was about to be demolished near Cedar Falls, Iowa. The property on rural Route 47 was going to be replaced with a new residential complex of condominiums. However, when John Martinez's excavator fell, the metal claws came into contact with compacted soil 3.5 meters behind the fallen barn, something that would cause anyone's blood to freeze. An olive military chest, green metal that was utilized in the Korean War, surfaced from the ground with an inscription that has been nearly forgotten. U.S. Army, Sergeant D.A. Reynolds, 1953. What was inside that chest, buried on a farm at a depth of 3 meters and 60 centimeters? Forgotten, would provide hints to one of the most unsettling disappearances in Cedar Falls past. Additionally, it would prompt further inquiries about what actually occurred to David Andrew Reynolds on a night in October of 1959. There was going to be an end to 60 years of stillness. However, the truth would stay as buried for 60 years as that chest had been. If you like situations that reject theories that delve into the dark corners of American history and force us to challenge all we believe to be true about common people, you are in the appropriate location. Turn on the bell and subscribe to the channel, since today we are going to examine every unsettling aspect of this case. And I swear that over the following 30 years, we will learn far more than anyone in Cedar Falls could have predicted. The evening of October 1959. This is the tale of David Reynolds, a devoted son, a war hero, and a guy who vanished like smoke on it, of a military chest that held its secrets for 60 years, and of an October night. David Andrew Reynolds was born in Cedar Falls on April 23, 1931. Margaret and Andrew Reynolds' only child, Iowa. He was a boy with dark brown hair that cascaded over his forehead in defiance, vivid green eyes that his were the same shade of green as the June cornfields, according to Mom, and a smile that everyone who knew him said that he brightened any setting. David's athletic physique and height of 1 meter and 78 centimeters gave him that composed, a presence that gave others a sense of security. David's early years were characteristic of 1930s and 1940s rural America. He was raised on the family farm, a 20-hectare farm that bred livestock and mostly produced corn. Each day, David would get up at 5 in the morning to assist his father in feeding the animals and milking the cows before school. He never grumbled and never requested to spend more time in bed. His dad used to remark that David was born with a strong work ethic. David was well known at Cedar Falls High School for his usually excellent math and history marks, but for his protective and kind disposition. His circle of friends was limited yet devoted. David and his co-workers would get together every Saturday night at Mel's Diner, a neighborhood eatery on Main Street that provided the county's greatest chocolate milkshakes. David's classmate, Susan Hartley, who was still residing in tears filled her eyes as she recalled Cedar Falls in 2019. David was the kind of boy that stood up for the weakest and would carry your books if you had a lot on your plate. After he prevented a younger youngster from being tormented by some bullies. Although David was not a combative person by nature, he had a really distinct moral line. However, David's life would take a significant turn in June of 1950, many months following his graduation. The Korean War began, and at the age of 19, David enlisted in the U.S. military in September of that year. Army. It wasn't an act of adventure-seeking or naive patriotism. David clarified in a letter he wrote to his mother at the time, which has been kept by the family. "Mother, I know. I have to do this because men are dying there, even if it will crush your heart. Families are being destroyed, so if I can do anything, no matter how tiny, I must." Margaret Reynolds kept that letter near her to try. That's what Dad would do, reading it before bed every night for the duration of the conflict. From November 1950 until July 1953, David served in Korea, attaining the rank of sergeant. He almost ever discussed what he's seen there, but the letters he sent home depicted a young guy who was trying to be human in the face of misery. He wrote, "Today, I helped a Korean family rebuild the wall of their house in February 1952. I received a sketch from the youngest girl, who can't be older than 5. She sketched a flower. She is still able to see flowers despite all of this devastation." At the age of 22, David had changed by the time he returned to Cedar Falls in August 1953. Quieter and more reflective, although others who knew him well said he was still. He was essentially the same polite and diligent David, with that expression that many soldiers carried with them, that remoteness in their eyes that implied a portion of them remained on some far-off battlefield. But David made it deliberate. He assumed management of the family property after his father passed away in an attempt to re-establish a connection with life in Cedar Falls. In 1954, Andrew had a little stroke. That became a personal goal for David, who would get up at 4:30 in the dawn, labor in the fields until dusk, and give the animals nearly religious care. Under his leadership, the farm flourished, and neighbors noted that David had a. David, however, was more than just a farmer. On Sunday afternoons, he volunteered to teach arithmetic to struggling kids at the First Methodist Church in the area on Parkway Avenue. Elizabeth Morrison, a pastoral assistant and was still living in 2010 when she conducted her final interview regarding the situation, recalled that David was incredibly patient with those kids, described geometry using fences, fractions using apples from his own farm, and barns. He brought mathematics to life and consistently concluded the sessions, claiming that you are more intelligent than you realize. All you need is someone who has faith in you. At the age of 26, David started working at Eat in 1957, dating Cedar Falls nurse Kathy Mitchell, 23. Hospital, David brought his mother to a regular doctor's appointment, which is how they first met. Kathy had blue eyes, wavy blonde hair, and a chuckle that, according to, made David forget all the grief he brought from the war to Margaret Reynolds. Their love took off right once, and they were frequently spotted together at church on Sundays, every Friday night at the downtown theater, and walking hand in hand on warm evenings in Cedar River Park. David suggested Kathy at a picnic on the banks of the Cedar in June 1959. River. He presented her with a simple gold ring set with a little stone that had once belonged to his grandmother. Before he could finish the question, Kathy replied in the affirmative. The wedding was planned on Thanksgiving Day, November 27, 1959. Margaret Reynolds had already started preparing, sewing Kathy's wedding gown herself, but there was something about David in those latter months of 1959 that concerned his loved ones. Margaret saw that her kid appeared preoccupied. Kathy told friends that David would occasionally wake up in the middle of the night, perspiring, and have that aloof expression, something she had come to identify with wartime recollections. "He says everything is all right," Kathy said Linda Shaw, her closest friend, "but I know something is troubling him." In the weeks before he vanished, David started arranging all of his war records, which was an odd move. Letters, photos, medals, and service certificates. He spent hours looking at that green military chest he had brought from Korea in the farmhouse's attic when his mother questioned what. "Just organizing the past, Mother," David remarked with a simple smile. Maintaining order is crucial. Nobody could have predicted that those words would have such a dark significance only a few weeks later. Thursday, the 15th of October of 1959. In Cedar Falls, the day began chilly with temperatures of about 8 degrees Celsius. The clouds in the dismal sky promised the season's first significant snowfall. The foliage of the trees beside rural Route 47 had taken on the rich hues of Midwestern American fall, including crimson and gold, and they fell in mesmerizing spirals due to the wind. At 4:45 in the morning, David Reynolds. Morning as usual. Margaret heard her son walking down the corridor, heading. From the top down, the wooden stairs creaked on the third step. The sound of the kitchen door opening and closing reached her ears. She would question if she ought to have gone down that morning and whether she ought to have prepared his coffee, if she ought to have talked to someone one more time. Thomas Brennan, at 6:15 a.m., the closest neighbor, whose property was around 800 meters distant, observed David at work in the barn. David waved back at Thomas. That was the final. When did Thomas see David Reynolds? Kathy Mitchell made a call at 8:30 a.m. The farm. Before turning in for the night, she wanted to hear her fiancé's voice because she had worked the night shift at the hospital. David was in the fields, Margaret explained when she responded, but she would urge him to come back. Kathy stated she didn't have to talk to him later. 10:45 in the mailman from Cedar Falls, Jund, Robert Hayes, delivered mail in the mailbox of Reynolds. He saw David's 1956 red Ford F-100 pickup truck parked close to the barn, but David was not there. This was not unusual. Farmers were constantly occupied and on the go. It is noon. Margaret made lunch while. She did it every time. Apple pie, handmade bread, and veggie soup. She waited till 12:15. 12:30. She went to the barn at 12:45 and called for her son. There was nobody in the barn. David had well-organized tools. David wasn't there, but the tractor was parked where it usually is. Margaret did. Don't freak out right away. Maybe David had gone to the farthest end of the property to inspect the fences. Maybe he had, for whatever reason, gone to town. But then she saw something that caused her to heartbeat. David's brown wool coat, which he wore throughout the winter, was suspended from the hook close to the kitchen door. David refused to go on an 8 degrees day. Without that coat, any place. Margaret made the call at 2 in the afternoon. Blackhawk County Police Department. She had a conversation with William Bill, the deputy sheriff. A 42-year-old guy named Crawford had known the Reynolds for many years. Margaret tried to sound calm as she described the circumstances, but Bill could sense anxiety in her voice, starting to infiltrate her speech. Mrs. Reynolds, Bill uttered in his soft and comforting voice, I'll send someone right now, but I'm sure there's a straightforward explanation. At 2:20 in the afternoon, David might have received a lift from someone to go to town. When Deputy Crawford and another officer got to the farm, they started a systematic search of the area. They discovered the fields, the barn, the main house, and the cattle barns. Everything appeared to be in excellent order, with the exception of David himself. At 3:15 p.m., they found something that would turn that search into something far more sinister than a potential misunderstanding. David stored smaller tools in the tiny workshop that was connected to the barn. Repairs, there were indications of disruption. Instruments that were they were arranged in a disorganized manner on the workbench and on the concrete floor, barely noticeable. Deputy Crawford bent down to look at what looked to be a few droplets of a dark liquid. Closer. That appeared to be blood. His stomach constricted. At 4 in the investigation was personally taken over by Sheriff Harold Thompson in the afternoon. Thompson aide, a 53-year-old guy with 30 years of law enforcement experience. He phoned for reinforcements as soon as he realized they had a severe problem. A dozen officers were searching the farm and its environs about 4:30. Kathy. At 5:15 p.m., Mitchell reached the farm after waking up, and when she called the Reynolds home, she found that David was not there. Margaret recalled that Kathy had left the hospital as soon as she awoke, still in her nursing outfit, was so pale that she appeared to be a ghost. Where is he? Kathy said again, gazing. Where is David? I asked, looking out at the deserted fields. At 5:45 in the evening, the sun started to set. The search grew more intense throughout the afternoon as the sky turned orange and purple. Community volunteers started to show up. Friends from church, neighbors, David's fellow battle veterans. In less than an hour, there were about 50. At 6:30 p.m., individuals were searching every square inch of the Reynolds farm and other properties. They discovered something else unsettling under the light of lanterns and makeshift spotlights around. 200 meters away from the workshop, toward the former Whitmore farm, they discovered a track on land that had been abandoned since 1956. It wasn't a clean trail, but faint soil disturbances, shattered branches, and trampled grass, as though They were told to follow by Sheriff Thompson because something or someone had been dragged. The DA's trail, which headed straight for the Whitmore farm. The historic site had deteriorated over the last 3 years. Windows were damaged, and the main home was in ruins. Like vacant eyes, the barn reflected the light from the lanterns. Collapsed. There was a general sense of degradation and abandonment that sent shivers down the spines of even the most seasoned cops. Searched the Whitmore estate until 10 o'clock at night, but all they discovered were deserted structures and the oppressive quiet of A.E.B. Thuy is a long-forgotten location with no trace of David Reynolds and no idea about where he might be or what had become of him. At 11 o'clock at night, Deputy Crawford made a last revelation that would rock the neighborhood. Concealed in the Reynolds Farms barn, in the farthest corner, he discovered David's military chest beneath a stack of hay. The same olive-green metal box with his belongings, the same chest that David had been organizing over the past few weeks. Military inscription, but it was absolutely empty now. Every medal, record, picture, letter, and other item David had retained so meticulously vanished, and at the base of the chest, inscribed with what? 4 unintelligible words that looked like a knife or key. We are protected by silence. The disappearance of David Reynolds was reported through, like a fire in a parched summer harvest, Cedar Falls. On Friday morning, on October 16th, the tiny hamlet with about 20,000 residents was in a state of communal shock. The local newspaper, the Gazette, published. The opening page tells the tale of a local military veteran who mysteriously vanishes. Conditions. On the Reynolds farm, Sheriff Harold Thompson set up a command center. Itself. On Friday, he called upon every Black Hawk County resource. The search was redoubled in the morning, with over 150 volunteers. Included veterans of the Korean War who had fought alongside David, searched the whole. They examined every barn within an 8-kilometer radius of the site. Every stream, every forest, every deserted building, the Whitmore farm got extra consideration. 2 of the Iowa Bureau of Criminal Investigations, James Porter and Marcus Sullivan, 2 of the top detectives, spent 2 full days inspecting every square inch of that deserted land. Yet they discovered precisely nothing. There was no indication that David or anybody else had struggled. Been there lately. The workshop's dark stains were sent to the Des Moines State Laboratory. On Tuesday, October 20th, the results showed that the blood was type O positive human blood from David Reynolds. But the quantity was minimal, roughly the same as a deep cut, insufficient to signify severe or lethal injuries. The words inscribed at the silence shields us at the bottom of the military chest, and it became the center of intense conjecture. Who had written it? What did it mean? Sheriff Thompson asked. David himself? Someone else? Linguists, psychologists, and even a University of Northern Iowa history professor were unable to offer a satisfying explanation. Kathy Mitchell was heartbroken and spent daily at the farm assisting Margaret, refusing to acknowledge that David had merely vanished. He would not leave, she said. Anybody who would listen. Not without. Bid farewell, but not without a reason. That is not David's personality. He experienced something horrible. The inquiry proceeded swiftly. The first notion was the most obvious of several, each more unsettling than the one before it. Crime. It's possible that David caught robbers or intruders off guard. Had been an unsuccessful confrontation, but there were issues with this theory. The house was undamaged. Nothing had been taken, and David's wallet held $140. Was discovered in his dresser. His truck was parked as usual, the keys in the ignition. Why didn't the thieves take anything if it was a robbery? David was a veteran of the war and had witnessed atrocities, so his second, darker theory was suicide. In Korea, according to some officials, David might be afflicted with what we post-traumatic stress illness today and made the decision to take his own life. Maybe he strolled to a far-off, secret location to pass away by himself. But those who? David was pleased that Kathy persisted despite knowing that David strongly disagreed with the plan. We were set to tie the knot in 6 weeks. and he was making plans for our future. Would not do this. The most contentious theory was the third one. David may have had second thoughts about the marriage and life in Cedar, leading to his voluntary defection. Falls about assuming control of the family property. Maybe he just fled to establish a new life somewhere else. But there were serious problems with this theory as well. David would never abandon his mother in sorrow because he loved her so much. And why leave money behind and only take the contents of his military chest? Whispers revealed a fourth theory: identification documents, everything else behind, and bar discussions, criminal activity. Some conjectured that David might have engaged in illicit activity, such as drug trafficking, which ultimately caught up with him. Even espionage and gambling were claimed, although there was no proof at all to substantiate any of these accusations. David had a perfect record. David was well known for his unshakable moral character. His family was being devastated by Margaret Reynolds, who had survived the Korean War, World War II, and the Great Depression, appeared to. She hesitated to leave the property, believing that David would turn 10 years old in a single week. Every night, she left meals warm on the stove and waited to hear from her when they returned home. Son's footsteps on the doorstep, the people of Cedar Falls reacted with exceptional assistance. Every week, the church held vigils and neighbors took, overseeing the Reynolds farm's operations, making sure the animals were fed, that before the first snowfall, the harvests were delivered, and a fund was set up to assistance with the investigation's expenses. But as October gave way to November and as winter's first snowfall arrived in November, David Reynolds' grim reality started to set in. Vanished, leaving almost little trace, and in spite of all the technology accessible in 1959, despite the unwavering commitment of law, nobody could provide an answer to the most straightforward and painful question: what happened to law enforcement and the community? David? November 27th, 1959, was supposed to be David and the worst day in Cedar Falls' recent history was Kathy's wedding. Rather than, the chapel was packed with individuals grieving a loss they had experienced at a celebration of unity. Kathy wore Margaret's wedding gown, which she was unable to correctly identify, sewn, sobbing quietly while seated in the church's front pew. It was her way of expressing her continued belief and hope that David would come back, but David Reynolds didn't show up that day, the following day, or ever since. The years have flown over Cedar Falls like quiet waves bearing memories. People are changing, environments are changing, but David's disappearance. Reynolds continued to be an open wound in the community's heart. In 1960, the formal inquiry was decreased to a low-priority task, and Sheriff Thompson never fully ceased working on the case, devoting a minimum of several hours each week to examining the material and pursuing fresh leads. But leads were getting harder to come by. Although the case was still open in theory, it was actually stuck in time, waiting. Margaret Reynolds never left the farm for a potential new development. She stayed there, maintaining the same conditions as the day David vanished. His work boots, clothes, and room were all still in the closet. She remained still by the entrance, following a nearly ritualistic rhythm, conversing with. "Good morning, sweetheart," she would say each morning, David as if he were still there, going past the door of his room in the morning. Visitors said that it was concurrently both heartbreaking and consoling. Kathy Mitchell did not get married. She went on, working as a nurse at Cedar Falls Hospital and devoting her life to helping people. The engagement ring was on her, that David granted her until the day of her passing in 1998, when friends politely proposed that maybe it was time to move on and think about other relationships. She only shook her head. She would say, "I made a commitment until death do us part, and I'm still unsure if he's dead." In 1965, a drifter was detained and designed for minor offenses 5 years after the disappearance. While being questioned, stated in passing that he had witnessed something odd close to Cedar Falls in the fall of 1959, a farm on Route 47 in the country. Investigators went right away to do an interview with him. The man's account was ambiguous and inconsistent. He asserted to have witnessed moving lantern-like lights at the Whitmore property late at night in mid-October. However, when his recollections were too hazy to be helpful when pressed for specifics, the lead was fruitless. The Whitmore farm was ultimately sold to a lumber business. The ground was leveled, the barn and main house were destroyed, and trees planted. If any evidence was concealed on the property, it was buried beneath layers of fresh soil and expanding woodland, or irreversibly destroyed. Margaret Reynolds died of heart failure in 1978 at the age of 74, but her loved ones were aware that it was indeed the result of a broken heart. She passed away without ever realizing what had occurred to her son. She bequeathed the land and a note to Kathy Mitchell in her will. To Kathy, who remained devoted to my son till the very end. I hope you find a tranquility I was never able to locate. After a few more years, Kathy sold the property in 1983. It was too terrible to be there, surrounded by recollections of a future that never materialized. The property was transferred multiple times throughout the ensuing decades, unaware of the catastrophe each new owner that had taken place there. In 1991, the original home was destroyed, swapped out for a contemporary home. The barn was reconstructed. The property itself underwent renovations. However, the memory remained. David Reynolds was never forgotten in Cedar Falls. Every few years, typically on the anniversary of the disappearance, the story commemorating the case will be published in the local newspaper. There are still no answers. The mystery surrounding David Reynolds started to make headlines frequently. Veterans who were older told tales to newer generations about him. Local history instructors used the case as an illustration of an unresolved issue in their lessons. Secrets of America's rural areas. Over the years, new theories have been developed. During the 1980s, some people conjectured that David might have been the victim of an unidentified serial murderer who was active in the area. As an examination of disappearances that occurred in the Midwest between 1955 and 1965 showed a potentially alarming pattern, but no clear link to David could be proven. With the development of the internet in the 1990s, fans of Unsolved in online forums, mystery started talking about the case. One in particular, according to a complex notion, David had found something connected to his experiences in the Korean War, something classified, making him a target. However, there was no proof at all to endorse this conspiracy theory. The phrase engraved was the most unsettling. Silence protects us. Those 4 words took on an almost legendary quality over time. What were they trying to say? Was it a danger, a plea, a warning? David, who were we? And someone else? Or something else entirely? Eventually, the farm where David vanished became a local tale among teens in Cedar Falls. Ghost stories eventually surfaced. In a barn that was no longer there, people reported seeing a person. These tools are being used in a long workshop. Destroyed. However, they were merely tales. The type of urban mythology that develops about unresolved tragedies. Then, 60 years following that cold, on October 1st, 1959, an excavator fell into a land designated for development, and it discovered something that had been neatly and deeply hidden so that it endured 6 decades of forgetting and change. The military of David Reynolds. The secrets of the chest were about to be revealed, but they weren't the ones everybody anticipated. It was November 16th, 2019. In Cedar, winter was returning. Fall's a dip in temperature, and the sky taking on that distinctive gray tone of the Midwest in November. 43-year-old digger John Martinez. He was prepping the land for the new Riverview Estates while employed by Morrison Construction Company, condominium on Route 47 in a remote area. The property had undergone significant changes over. Few employees on the site were aware of its history during those years. A few of the older ones dimly recalled that something had occurred there decades prior, albeit the specifics were unclear. For the majority, it was just another task, a lot more area to prepare and clear. John was employed at the space behind the former barn. Morrison Building had records demonstrating the demolition of older buildings there in the 1990s. And John's responsibility was to make sure the land was free of any debris or existing foundations before new construction got underway. At 10:23 a.m., the excavator's metal claws struck a solid object at a distance of 3 meters and 60 centimeters depth. The tremor echoed through the controls, and John could feel it. He was aware of that feeling. Old concrete and rock. He came down from the apparatus to look into it. What surfaced from the compacted dirt caused John to automatically take a step back. It was the kind of military chest he had seen in Army surplus shops. Decades of rust and filth have covered olive green metal, but nonetheless structurally sound. And underneath the Earth's and time's surface, just barely perceptible, was an inscription. U.S. Army, Sergeant D.A. Reynolds, 1953. John called Thomas Crane, his boss, right away. Thomas showed up 3 minutes later, subsequently experiencing dyspnea. His stomach twisted as he glanced at the chest. Thomas was 56 years old. Growing up in Cedar Falls, he recalled the tales. Everyone who was raised in Cedar Falls throughout the 1960s and 1970s was familiar with the tale of David Reynolds. Thomas, don't touch anything else. His voice was strained as he gave an order. We are now making a police call. At 11:50 a.m., Cedar Falls Police Department officers showed up at the location. At 11:30, Iowa Division detectives of criminal investigation were en route. At noon, a whole forensic team had surrounded the excavation site with a perimeter. The chest was meticulously taken out of the ground. For its tiny, it was incredibly hefty, indicating that it held something significant. However, in contrast to the chest discovered in the Reynolds Barn Inn, this one was secured in 1959 with a military padlock that was rusted but still functioning. The Reynolds investigation was handled by Detective Sarah Chun, who specializes in cold cases. Example from years ago as a personal endeavor. At the age of 39, she had moved from California to Iowa in 2010 and developed a fascination with David's mystery. When she started looking at cases from the past, she had conducted interviews with all those who were. Kathy Mitchell was one of the few people who were still living and had known David. Months before to her passing, Sarah observed forensic technicians at work, carefully to open the chest without obliterating any possible proof. 45 minutes passed. In the AB, at 12:53, the padlock was eventually taken off in the afternoon. The rusty hinges creaked when the lid was progressively raised. Even the most seasoned investigators were mute about what was within. The chest held all that had vanished in 1959 from the other chest. David's military decorations, such as his Bronze Star and Purple Heart, honorable discharge documents, pictures of him with his comrades in Korea. However, there was much more. A leather-bound diary was present that nobody was aware of. David's careful handwriting filled pages upon pages, from the time he served in Korea to October 1959. Additionally, scores of messages in odorless envelopes addressed to everyone in Cedar Falls, including Sheriff Thompson, Kathy, and his mother. Additionally, the bottom of the chest was meticulously covered with an oiled cloth to keep moisture out for 60. There was a Colt 45 handgun for years, an unfired military model that was spotless and well-preserved with a box next to it, of ammunition, unaltered. However, the envelope at the top of everything was what caused Sarah's heart to race. A typical white envelope with just 2 sentences on it. For discovery, it is written in cursive. Detective Chun donned gloves, and the envelope was carefully opened. There were 2 sheets of paper inside, both packed with the handwriting of David. It was a letter. As soon as Sarah started reading, she became aware that what they believed to be true regarding David Reynolds' disappearance was going to be inverted. The first line of the letter was, "If you are reading this, then my greatest fear has materialized, and I beg your pardon for everything I was forced to do." David Reynolds' letter, which was buried for 60 years and was completely preserved in the chest. Years was transcribed and graphology specialists examined it to verify authenticity, and in January 2020, it was made public. What it disclosed was both profoundly unsettling and illuminating. On the evening of October 14th, 1959, David composed the ET letter, less than 24 hours prior to his disappearance. Every phrase was picked with care. Every single. The words had the weight of a decision that was unachievable. Within the letter, David clarified that while serving in Korea, he and his unit had seen something that the Army was keen to maintain secrecy. He didn't say precisely what, utilizing. With the words, "We seen what our own side could accomplish when no one else was observing," he said, adding that 3 members of his unit had perished in dubious circumstances over the years. Following the conflict, one in a 1956 auto accident. A third had vanished in 1958, and another had apparently committed suicide in 1957. David said that someone claiming to represent national security interests had contacted him in the early October 1959. He was given an option: vanish willingly, assume a different identity in return for a promise of security for his family, or suffer repercussions that would be beyond my control. I can't take a chance on them, harming Kathy or my mother. I cannot risk them destroying the people I like for something I witnessed years ago, and they assured me that if I complied, my family would be at rest if I just vanished without being questioned. If I battled, if I attempted to reveal, everyone I care about would suffer because of what I know, David stated. To cause him to vanish on October 15th, he would be removed during the day, taken to an unidentified place, and given a new identity. They guarantee that I won't be harmed, he wrote, simply eliminated, deleted. David, however, had prepared his own act of defiance. In the days before the absence, he had buried this trunk that had all of his service records and the journal in which he captured all of his knowledge. He had abandoned the firearm as proof that he wasn't leaving voluntarily, that he had means to defend himself, but he decided against fighting to keep the people he cared about safe. David wrote, "Silence protects us," clarifying the words he had personally inscribed on the opposite chest. Those of us who are aware, the ones who witnessed, keep quiet to keep our loved ones safe. I bury this fact in the hopes that one day there will be enough time has passed, and if the people who threatened us are no longer in charge, someone will discover this and realize that we weren't just cowards and didn't flee away, that we chose the unachievable option presented to us. The letter concluded, "Mother, please pardon your absence," with words that would shatter anyone's heart. "Please understand, Kathy, that every moment spent apart from you will be a tiny death, but I leave because if I stay, if I fight, you'll pay the price, and I'd rather be banished than have. I love you more than words can express, and my biggest regret is that I have your blood on my hands, that you will live your entire lives ignorant of the truth. I'm terribly sorry." David's diary. He filled a 200-page notebook with further information systematically. Recorded particular incidences involving civilians that he had seen throughout the Korean War. Dubious command choices, which, if disclosed in 1959 may have resulted in a major worldwide scandal during the height of the Cold War. David's diary details were verified for months by Detective Chun and her colleagues against military records that have been declassified, speaking with military historians, consulting specialists. The outcome was unsettling. David's writing was in line with known but concealed Korean War events. He had, in fact, the reopened inquiry also revealed information that the U.S. Army was keen to conceal. Found something remarkable in the National Archives. Newly declassified documents revealed that David stated that the remaining 3 members of his unit had perished in the years following the war. All of them had been under FBI observation due to dubious circumstances. Their official deaths, reported as self-inflicted or accidental. However, there were odd discrepancies in the reports. However, the most crucial query remained unsolved. What became of David following the 15th of October 1959? Had he indeed been abducted and given a new identity? Had he passed away, or was he still living someplace under a different name? David had been forever silenced on the false promise of security. That day, Detective Chun pursued every lead she could find, looking through documents of military relocation files, witness protection initiatives, and protected identities, but if David Reynolds was still alive, he had been obliterated to such an extent that no. There was evidence of him, and one such clue surfaced in March of 2020. An old guy reading about the case in a Portland, Oregon nursing home phoned the authorities after seeing an article in the newspapers claiming to have known a Dan Robbins was a man in the 1970s who had stated peculiar aspects of leaving behind a life in Iowa. Yet when investigators pursued the lead, they learned that Dan Robbins had passed away in 1994, and any proof that would have connected him to David Reynolds had vanished over time. Examination of the earth near where. When the chest was discovered, it revealed something interesting. The ground had been disturbed, dug up, and replenished twice. Firstly, in October 1959, David buried the chest, most likely, and again at some point between 1959 and, according to geological studies, someone had come back in 1965, excavated close to the chest position but failed to locate it. Were they searching for it, attempting to retrieve the proof that David had left behind, or was it something else entirely? Even decades after their deaths, David's loved ones found some closure when the chest was found. David's classmate, Susan Hartley, who was 92 years old and still living, remarked, "He did not desert us," he said, shedding tears. "He didn't flee. He made a sacrifice. Everything to keep us safe." That's the David I was familiar with. However, it also raised unsettling concerns of authority, confidentiality, and the extent to which the government was ready to take action to safeguard sensitive data. How many other David Reynolds were there? How many other individuals were compelled to decide between their family's safety and their own lives? Over 65 years have passed since that chilly October morning when David Reynolds vanished. The matter is still officially unresolved. David's ultimate destiny, whether he lived for a few days or decades after that. The date of October 15th, 1959, is yet uncertain. The police of Cedar Falls. The case remains ongoing between the department and the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation. Sarah Chun, a detective, has been promoted to lieutenant, keeps working on it when time allows. She has conducted interviews with several people, pursued hundreds of leads, and individuals looking through declassified documents totaling thousands of pages. However, whoever David Reynolds became, he is still lost in the past. David kept a journal, published in 2021, although some parts are still classified. For concerns of national security, it developed into a crucial military document. Historians were searching the Korean War and its aftermath for veterans. This acted as a sobering reminder of the unseen costs of war. Eventually, land on the rural Route 47 where David vanished was developed. The condominium at Riverview Estates was finished in 2021. However, the developers acknowledged the history of the location, created a modest memorial, and placed a straightforward bronze plaque on a stone honoring Sergeant David Andrew Reynolds, who served from 1931 to 1959. A devoted son, a devoted fiancé, a war hero who made the ultimate sacrifice, made the decision, banished in order to defend his loved ones. After 60 years of being hidden, his truth finally emerged to light. May we never forget those who endured quiet suffering in order to keep others safe. The weapon discovered in the chest underwent a thorough analysis. Although it was loaded, it never dismissed. David could have used it to defend himself, but he decided not to, according to forensic experts. It was his final declaration of nonviolent protest and his refusal to use force. Into an unfeasible circumstance. The deceased Kathy Mitchell, 1998 at the age of 64, I was unaware of David's true fate. She lived for 59 years without realizing that the man she loved had not deserted her, but instead He made the biggest possible sacrifice for her. According to Susan Hartley, Kathy should have known that he loved her, and it pains me that she didn't. For her was so strong that he would sacrifice everything, including her, in order to preserve her. Safe. Margaret Reynolds was similarly unaware of the reality. She lived for 19 years following David's disappearance, awaiting unanswered questions. However, people who were acquainted with her during her latter years claimed to have an unwavering conviction. David didn't choose to leave us. My son was a good man. If he left, he had a reason, and one day we will be aware of what it was. Margaret was correct. We finally know after 60 years. However, there's still some unanswered questions. Did David make it out alive? Did he endure a long life under a false identity, bearing the burden of his recollections and contemplating his mom and Kathy, looking forward to the day he could come home? Or was the promise of security was a cruel fiction, and David was soon silenced for good? Following their capture on that October day, were there times when he nearly brought back? On certain evenings, did he come close to picking up the phone or writing a letter, nearly jeopardized his family's security to inform them that he was alive? Or did he remain disciplined like a soldier till the very end, quiet and obedient even when banished? And the words he inscribed, "We are protected by quiet." Were they accurate? Was Margaret and Kathy protected by silence? Also, was it merely what David had to think in order to defend the unthinkable sacrifice he had to make? There are those who think David is still alive. He would be 94 years old, an elderly man, possibly in a nursing home, possibly by himself, carrying secrets that were unimaginable to those around him. Maybe he reads about the chest finding. Maybe he is aware that his truth was revealed at last. Maybe that calms him down a little. Or maybe David Reynolds has been absent for a very long period. His narrative was lost aside from the facts he meticulously kept and buried in Iowa dirt at a depth of 60 centimeters and 3 meters, waiting for someone to locate. Uncomfortable realities are brought to light by the David Reynolds case. That there are individuals who endure quiet suffering and make sacrifices that we are unaware of. That tales concealed by secrecy and the passage of time may never fully reveal themselves. That the true cost of war is not solely determined by lives killed in combat, but in the lives that were quietly ruined years later, away from the glory and the spotlight. It also serves as a reminder that occasionally the line between bravery and tragedy, between hero and victim, is as thin as the unfeasible decision between combat and self-sacrifice. David Andrew Reynolds made the decision to make a sacrifice. He opted for quiet. He decided to go into exile, not out of love rather than timidity. And that decision is memorialized in fading handwriting on perhaps the oldest pages found inside a military box that has been buried for 60 years. The best evidence of his character that we could find. If you're hearing this, no matter where you are, David, know that your mother and we love you, Kathy, and we remember your sacrifice. The young man with green eyes who created mathematics is still remembered in Cedar Falls. Come to life for kids who cherished his family and his land, who served his honorable nation, and that maybe we'll discover the remainder of the narrative. Your mystery endures till then, not as a sign of failure, but as a reminder that some tales are so profound, intricate, and agonizingly human that they resist easy fixation. When David Reynolds's military chest was discovered, his reality was disclosed. However, 65-year-old David Reynolds is still where he chose to be. Back then, in exile and in solitude, defending the people he cared about in the only way he knew how. And maybe that's sufficient in the end. Not a response, but a statement, not closure, but in homage to a man who took the hardest route, because it was the only route his heart would permit. David Andrew Reynolds has not been seen since 1959, but it will always be remembered